So I want to say welcome to everyone. My name is Christy Craig, and I'm the publisher at Hidden Timber Books. And thank you so much for being here for another event of our small press author reading series. Part of the purpose of running this series is to introduce you to some of the independent presses across the country, as well as the authors who publish with them. And one thing I've been doing lately in light of some of the things happening around the country is just introducing readers to books by authors that you may or may not know, just to give you another opportunity to read and educate yourself as far as being an upstander and an ally. And this is a book that I picked up recently. It's a memoir by Vivian Gibson, The Last Children of Mill Creek. And Vivian Gibson grew up in Mill Creek Valley, and she writes about family and about home, and she writes about urban renewal as an act of racism. And it's not a very big memoir. It's published by Belt Publishing, which is in Ohio. And I've heard a lot of great stuff. So this is on my to be read list, and I wanted to share it with you guys. So thank you again for being here. And thank you to Vanessa Hua for being here to read with us today. Again, if you have any tech troubles, you can reach out to me over the chat box. And when we get to the Q&A, you can also use the chat box to let me know you've got a question, or to type in your question, or you can raise your hand, and I'll be keeping an eye out for those things. Just to share a little bit with you about Vanessa. She is an award-winning best-selling author of River of Stars, and now of the short story collection Deceit and Other Possibilities, which received an Asian Pacific American Award in Literature. It was the finalist for the California Book Award and a New York Times Editor's Choice. So it's an excellent collection of stories about immigrant families and how they are navigating through a new America. So I'm terribly excited to hear more about the book and the stories, and to get to know you, Vanessa, and your work. So I will pass the baton to you. Thanks so much for being here.
Okay. Thank you so much, Christy, for hosting. I like what you're saying about sort of like a tour of small presses. I think small presses in the U.S. are printing some of the most sort of exciting or experimental or just like diverse set of voices out there. So I'm really grateful to small presses like Counterpoint. I think often, and thanks to all of you who have tuned in. I know it's, sometimes it's a, strange and time we're in that sometimes like, it feels like you don't even remember what day it is, let alone what hour or week. So I'm really glad to be sharing this space with you today, and excited to hear any questions you might have, not only about Deceit and Other Possibilities, but also if you have any questions about the writing life, or what it means to be a writer right now amid so much change in this country. I'd be happy to discuss. But I thought I'll tell you a bit about the book, do some reading, and talk some more. When people ask me, like, what is Deceit and Other Possibilities about? I tell them model minorities behaving badly. And it's 13 stories written over the course of a decade and a half. Following either immigrants or children of immigrants in different settings. But it was interesting. It wasn't until, each of these stories were published individually at literary magazines. And, sometimes I would submit a story 3 times, sometimes I'd submit it 20. I've heard of writers who submit up to 100 times before each of their, before one of their stories gets published. But it was interesting to see that they had one life in a literary magazine, but then when I assembled it together in a collection that was first published in 2016 by Willow Books, and then re-released in 2020 with 3 new stories, it was really interesting to kind of see the ways in which they resonated with each other as a collection. That even though they had existed individually, on their own, they had a chat with each other. And in the same way that Sometimes, like if I meet a writer who I really, I like them, and then I'm excited when it seems like our books might be friends together. It's exciting to see the ways in which your stories are, I don't know, have affinities, even if on the surface, the setting or the character or, everything else is different, but there is that sense of commonality. And I think for me, it wasn't until it was a collection that I realized that it had this theme of secrets and lies, that I didn't set out to write it. I wasn't thinking, oh, every story is going to hinge on a central lie. But in fact, that's how it turned out that way over, the course of 15 years with this edition. And I think it just says something to the fact of, you are going to be drawn to the things that interest you over and over again, whether or not it's intentional. You're always circling around a question in your work, whether it's a story or a novel, or if you're looking across the body of your work. So I thought I'd start off by reading a story that now actually feels almost a little bit quaint because of where we are. Doesn't everything feel like historical fiction now? But it's set at a university. It's set at Stanford. And I'll read you, the Stanford that we knew, not the Stanford of the future, or the Stanford that has the big question mark going forward. But anyway, we'll just read from the beginning. Accepted. It occurred to me that I'd become too comfortable with breaking and entering. Back from field training, I'd leapt onto the windowsill in a single bound, no awkward scrambling, as though onto a pommel horse. I tiptoed in the dark until realizing my roommates were out. Too tired to shower, I collapsed onto the futon and fired up Julia's laptop to fill the void with light and noise. We met fall quarter after I studied her for a half hour while she sunbathed. Julia seemed like the kind of girl who adopted wounded birds and stray puppies, willing to help a newcomer in need. I told her I had nowhere to stay because of a mix-up in housing. Officials said they might find something within a week or two, but until then, I'd be sleeping in the 24-hour room at the library. What a way to start freshman year. Julia, a sophomore, invited me to crash in the room she shared with her best friend. One night turned into a week, another and another, and then we're at the end of the quarter, dead week, finals, and saying our goodbyes for the holidays. Without their knowledge, my roommates had aided and abetted me. My classmates considered me no different than them, these student body presidents, valedictorians, salutatorians, national merit scholars, model UN reps, academic decathletes, all-state swimmers and wrestlers, and other shining exemplars of America's youth. The rejection from admissions was a mistake. That's what I told myself after I clicked on the link and logged onto the portal last spring. Stanford had denied another Elaine Park, another in Irvine who'd also applied. I waited for a phone call of apology, along with an email with the correct link. I hadn't meant to lie, not at first, but when Jack Min donned his Stanford sweatshirt after receiving his acceptance, I yanked my cardinal red hoodie out of my locker. Another week passed, and I posed with Jack for the school paper. A banner year for the church our families both attended, and for Sparta High, with 2 students in a single class admitted to Stanford. When I showed my parents the article as proof of my acceptance, Appa held the newspaper with his fingertips, as if it were bridal lace he was preserving on special order. He reeked of chemicals from the cleaners, the stink of exhaustion and servility. Assiduous, he said. His praise for my hard work. My vocab drills, which began nightly when I was in kindergarten, had fallen to him. For years, he'd been reading the dictionary for self-improvement, and the words we'd studied together coded what otherwise might remain unsaid. Sagacity, I replied. I was thanking him for his wisdom. In June, with graduation approaching, I politely alerted admissions of its error. You haven't received any notification? The woman asked on the other end of the line. A rejection? For another Elaine Park, I said. Only then did I realize how ridiculous I sounded. Could I appeal the decision or get on the wait list, I asked. No, she gently said. She explained those chosen off the wait list had been notified 2 weeks ago and wished me the best of luck. All those hours, all that money, the after-school academic cram programs whose costs kept us from moving out of our tiny 2-bedroom apartment. Other sacrifices. Appa put off visiting the doctor until his colds turned into bronchitis and then pneumonia. Uma's eyes went bad, squinting at the alterations she did for extra cash at the dry cleaners where we both worked. Stanford was the only school to which I'd applied, the only school my parents imagined me attending. I was supposed to become a doctor and buy my parents a sedan and a house in a gated community. A doctor had a title, respect, and would never be brushed off like them, never berated by customers, and never snubbed by sales clerks. When I asked the admissions officer if I could send additional letters of rec, her tone turned icy. We never were first decision officially rendered. She hung up. The problem, I came to understand, was that my story was too typical. My scores, my accomplishments, and my volunteer work were identical to hundreds, maybe thousands of other applicants, and admissions had reached its quota of hard luck, hardworking children of immigrants. I'd been too honest, straightforward where I should have embellished, ordinary where I should have been fanciful. My classmate Jack, he'd launched his own startup sending used cell phones to Africa. If only I'd been homeless. If only I'd knit socks and mittens for orphans in China. If only I'd had cancer. So that's from the beginning of Accepted, and she's going to get into a lot more trouble before she gets out of it. But the inspiration for this story came about, some of you may remember back in 2007, the case of a Stanford imposter. She had told everyone that she'd gotten in and that she'd gotten a scholarship, and she made her way to campus, and she, convinced people to let her stay with them in the dorms. She would go to classes, join study groups, take the test and, hand in her blue book. But it was sometime in the middle of the year that a resident advisor realized, wait, you don't go here. You're not a student. And she quickly, left campus and, from what I can tell is nowhere on social media. She may well have changed her name. But, I thought it was interesting at the time, was working on another project, but it was like one of those stories that I kept thinking about. And then I began hearing about other examples. There was a case at UC Irvine of someone who's South Asian, had told his family he was in medical school. He was not. They showed up for graduation. And he had gone so far as to rent a robe so he could march in the procession. But since med school classes are so small, he got called out by someone who actually was graduating. There was another case at UC Riverside in which someone who is Southeast Asian had failed out. His parents showed up for graduation. Graduation is always the tricky point. And he called in a bomb threat and planted Molotov cocktails in an attempt to sort of halt commencement ceremony. So, so what's obviously not all Asian Americans in higher education are con artists, but it really just got me thinking, what was it, what are the circumstances in which people might feel like, I'll just tell this lie, and then you have to add other lies, and you see it as maybe a family. It's not just about saving face for yourself, but like somehow it's for your family. And for me, that's often where my stories or novels begin, just sort of a premise of what if and why, and just trying to understand how someone got into that situation and how they'll attempt to get out of it. But just to sort of, talk a bit more about my background. I wanted to add this story Accepted. It's been on my mind lately because of two things. I get alerts for when it pops up online anywhere, and it, amusingly enough, it popped up in one of those cheating term paper databases like gradesaver.com. And someone, and it feels almost like a form of flattery, but someone had written a term paper that they were selling about this short story and this short story collection. Except that they got my name wrong. They said, in Jessica Hua's Deceit and Other Possibilities, which I thought was quite funny. It's also been, that story in particular has also been on my mind because, you know, some people have optioned it, and they were sort of like, I was on the phone with them last week and we were talking about sort of the direction they were taking with it. And it was sort of interesting and exciting to see the ways in which they, you know, it's a short story, but the ways they are like sort of expanding the world with characters that I felt would help benefit it if it ever did sort of make it to the screen. But anyway, we can talk more about that. But in terms of, you know, whenever I teach a story, I think, you know, I've taught it at high school or college level, sometimes like students will be like, oh, well, you know, is this her? Is she telling her life story? She did go to Stanford. But, you know, so I'll actually tell you my true life story, in which I'm the American-born daughter of Chinese immigrants who grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I think from early on, I realized that our family was not like the other ones on the block. You know, what we ate, what our house smelled like, everything was different than, you know, sort of like my friends' houses or, you know, whatever I saw on TV. And I realized that there were things my parents couldn't, you know, explain or wouldn't explain. Maybe they just didn't know, and that I'd have to find out answers on my own. And that would be through observation. I'm a very curious person, you know, and but also through books. And I think, you know, for as long as I can remember, I've been a big reader, and then that stems, you know, and then that is where my desire to write came from as well. I think my childhood heroes were, you know, characters like Anne of Green Gables, Jo March from Little Women, and Anne and Laura Ingalls from the Little House series. And they were all headstrong young women who wanted to write, and they sort of become writers. And the fact, even though we didn't share the same ethnicity or generation, just knowing this was something that you could want somehow made it feel more possible for me. So, you know, I've been writing from early age. I distinctly remember in the second grade, we all had to write a short piece of fiction, and the teacher read everyone's pieces out loud, and then the class voted by raising their hand on which one they liked the best. And I won. But before I could savor this victory, I overheard a classmate lean over and say, I only voted for hers because it was the longest. So it was both my first public recognition and first snarky review. So, but I persisted, I kept writing. And it was in college that I, you know, gained an interest in journalism, and, you know, just realizing like, oh, I can have license to go ask strangers questions about anything I want. This sounds great. So I was, I continued writing, but I was focused on my journalism. And I, you know, I think a couple of years later though, I was looking at some of my old stories and wondering like, do I remember how to do this? It was sort of like, these are pretty good, but I don't know if I remember how to do this. And I don't know if any of you out there have sort of had that feeling as well, of like having been in something, some interest or passion, and then being away from it for a little bit and just wondering like, do I remember who I was or how to do that? So I started taking, you know, workshops and joining writing groups that I found on Craigslist, or like I remember joining a writing group like based off a flyer that I, you know, tore off a tab at a cafe. But, you know, and I'd write stories on work on my fiction on weekends, or, you know, at lunch, at work, from, you know, I worked at the San Francisco Chronicle. But I always knew I wanted to write a novel, and it just seemed sort of out of my reach. And so I was on a journalism reporting trip to Korea. Journalism has given me the opportunity to report from China, Burma, Panama, Ecuador. You know, I feel very lucky for that. But anyway, I was in South Korea and talking to one of the other journalists, and I said, "Oh, I've always wanted to write a book," sort of wistfully. And she looked at me and said, "Then write a book." And she was just making conversation, but it really resonated with me that somehow, in whatever way I found I needed to make it the center of, you know, I needed to find a way in which the best part of myself or the best part of my writing was situated in my fiction. And for me, I decided I'd go to grad school and get my MFA at the University of California, Riverside. I know many writers who take other paths. You can sort of do it yourself MFA through conferences and workshops and writing groups. But for me, Riverside, with the professors I was able to study with, like Susan Straight and Chris Abani and Michael Jaime, was really a great place where I could, focus on a book length piece of fiction. But I must admit, the novel that I worked on in grad school, when it went out on submission in 2009, in the depths of the recession, it came close, but did not sell. And I was heartbroken, but the only thing to do was just to keep writing. And so, DECEIT and Other Possibilities, I entered it into contests a number of times over the years. And in 2016, it was published after winning the Willow Books contest. And then 2 years later, my novel, A River of Stars, which is a pregnant Chinese Thelma and Louise, it sold. And happily, it was sold as a 2-book deal. So the novel I worked on in grad school became the first book I wrote, will be the 3rd book I publish. And we can talk more about that. And that's about Chairman Mao's teenage lover set during the Cultural Revolution. But anyway, so DECEIT and Other Possibilities, this edition came about after the rights reverted to me last year, and my agent sent it around, and was really thrilled when Counterpoint was interested, and I was able, to make this edition, make it stand apart by adding 3 additional stories. One which I had been working on actually since college, if you can believe it. I graduated in 1997, but I think there are some stories you just can't quit, or you just can't write until enough time passes. And so it was one of those stories that I revisited, I guess, over decades until I finally figured out how I would end it. Let me see. Maybe now I'll read just a little bit more. Another selection. And it's inspired by my reporting in Chinatown and in San Francisco's Chinatown, and also by my time reporting from China. So, The Older, the Ginger. Sometime after lunch, old Zhang realized he'd been kidnapped. On the way from the airport, his cousin had taken a detour. If he'd driven in circles or gone the wrong direction, old Zhang wouldn't have known the difference. In the countryside west of Hong Kong on the Pearl River Delta, the rutted roads looked alike, and the flash of return, of welcome, hadn't yet arrived. More than a half-century ago, he left the hills green with pine and bamboo for San Francisco, and hadn't returned since. His cousin wasn't the son of an aunt or an uncle, but a relative of some kind from the village. Less than an hour into the drive, his cousin parked in front of a restaurant. They were the only customers at the only table, and the only staff, his cousin's daughter, Little Treasure. It was startling to find himself in high demand after his years among the bachelors of Chinatown. Finding a wife had been a competitive endeavor, and old Zhang hadn't much to differentiate himself as a suitor, just another waiter turned cook. Then his mother had written, insisting old Zhang marry. She was 93, he was 76. Come back, she told him. Come back and find a wife. Little Treasure dropped off toothpicks in a bowl of lychees and poured another cup of tea, but he refrained from drinking. He had a long ride ahead to the village. His leaky bladder didn't need more pressure, and the strong brew made him jittery. But when he tried to turn the handle of the door, it didn't budge. It must be stuck. The wooden frame warped and swollen. "Hey, hey," he shouted. Little Treasure tugged on his elbow. "Uncle, eat." She looked at him coyly from beneath her lashes. "Does it taste how you remember?" "We filled ours with air," he said. During his childhood, his family ate meat only once a year during the spring festival, but this young girl had never known such want, only China on the rise and none of its turmoil. He knocked again and leaned his weight against the door. Locked. He searched for another exit, but didn't see another door, and the sole window was too small to squeeze through. He heard of brides abducted by grooms, but never a kidnapped groom. His cousin must want to present his daughter to old Zhang to make her the first and most memorable candidate for marriage, and the green card that came along with the deal. In time, she could sponsor her parents, her siblings, their spouses, and their children to immigrate, a prize her father wouldn't let slip out of his fingers. "Uncle, eat." Little Treasure had a broad, plain face, placid as a cow, her beauty residing in the cascade of inky black hair that fell to her waist. In a tight t-shirt and flare jeans, she was as tall as him and twice as strong, with the muscular arms of a model revolutionary. She could level weeds and enemies alike. She could pin him to a narrow bed that he now noticed beneath a calendar of beer models. "Uncle, he'll be back soon. Sit, sit. You've had a long flight." He settled into his chair. Even if he escaped, he didn't know where he was or how far he'd have to walk to his village. Soon enough, his cousin would understand that love at first sight hadn't transpired. Her hand crept to his thigh. He pushed it away. "Let me help you," she whispered. He shuffled away, wondering if his cousin was spying through a crack, trying to catch old Zhang in an indelicate position. And who could blame him? China was becoming a superpower that launched astronauts into space, put on an Olympics breathtaking in its scale and magnificence, and might soon become the Middle Kingdom around which the world revolved. But for now, his cousin and Little Treasure remained mired in this backwater, where old Zhang presented the best and only prospects. Little Treasure wept, burying her face into her hands. "Young maiden," he began. "Young?" Her cheeks glittered with tears. "You should see who they have picked out for you. Girls pried from their dolls. I'm a leftover woman." "You don't want an old gingeroot like me," old Zhang said. "The older the ginger, the hotter the spice," she said. "When is he coming back?" he asked. "As long as it takes," she said. "You're my last chance." "You're not old enough to be thinking about the end," he said. "No one wants meat that's gone off," she said. She pushed the bowl of lychees toward him, which he ate to cleanse his greasy mouth. He spat the shiny pit into his cup palm, and he had another, savoring the sweetness. His mother used to peel lychees for him, digging in her thumbnail to break the flesh. Old Zhang had been his mother's firstborn and her favorite. When he was very young, he followed her to the river where she beat laundry against the rocks. How mighty she had seemed, warm mud squishing between his toes, sunshine heavy on his cheek, and the smell of the river, of wind and water on churned earth. Little Treasure cleared the table, and he smelled the dank musk of her, straw and loamy soil, and all at once he remembered his boyhood, the life he'd left behind, and he was overcome with longing for this lost world. He closed his eyes, inhaling. So that's from The Older the Ginger. And I think all of us might be longing for the lost worlds out there. So I can keep chatting, or Christy, if you have any questions for me, or if anyone has questions for me, I'd love to chat with you.
Yeah, I was making a lot of notes while you were reading, and just, you know, I can certainly relate a lot to what you were talking about. One of them, you know, being that feeling of appreciating headstrong young women in literature. I love that. And I think, you know, part of the beginning of Hidden Timber Books was publishing two older women who were 87 and 88, and it was their first book, and it was just a joy to be able to do that for them. And I'll admit that everyone so far that we've published have been women, and I'm not ashamed of that at all. I think bringing those voices into literature and to greater audiences is really important. So I love that you're saying that, and I love that those are some of the characters that you're writing about. And I also could certainly relate to, you know, talking about how do you do this after such a long time, and getting back to work that you may have put off for a while. And you know, sometimes we need permission from someone, a stranger or a friend, and sometimes we need, you know, for me, it was a friend who said the same thing, like, if you want to do it, why don't you just write? You know, like, what are you waiting for?
Right,
so,
right.
you know, I love that. I think a lot of times that's what we need as writers. And, you know, I'm so interested in your journey as a writer, and moving from journalism to fiction writing. I knew that this book was published once and republished, but I had thought that your novel came before the short stories, which was a question I was going to ask before
Yeah.
about moving between those two genres. But as you started out as a journalist, you know, what are some of the skills that translated into your fiction writing? You were talking about the last story you read, and the first story that you read being inspired by current events and things like that. So do you come at a story as a journalist first, or do you come at a story as a fiction writer first, do you think?
Oh, sure. And thank you for these great questions. And, you know, it's interesting what you're saying about the first authors you published were women in their 80s. And I think there was a thread kind of going around on Twitter yesterday just about, like, you know what, I didn't start publishing until my 40s. Like, I think sometimes there's this cult of youth, and, like, it's okay. You will get to it when you get to it, and don't feel sort of panicked. You know, you realize, I think for me, reaching my 40s, I wasn't sad at all. Like, it was just, in some ways, it was like a certain clarity about, like, I just, times, I know what's more important to me now. So, or maybe it's like, I know who I am. But in terms of, you know, I realize I forgot to totally bring up, you know, I only nominally touched upon my journalism career, but yeah, I mean, you know, I had multiple beats. You know, I worked at the Hartford Courant, the LA Times, the San Francisco Chronicle. I covered Asian American affairs, tech, you know, digital culture, which meant I got to convince my paper to send me to Burning Man, which was a lot of fun, and you know, minority business affairs. So, I mean, I think I've always been, in some ways, like, I still were gravitating to the same kinds of stories, like entrepreneurs or artists or outsiders, people trying to make something out of nothing, but then sort of like taking a look at sort of the systemic or structural things that stand against them, you know, no matter what they do, and you know, just trying to understand what measure of freedom people try to carve out for themselves and their community. And so there's that aspect. And I'm also aware that, you know, something that I've been work hard at as a journalist and as a fiction writer is just that notion that no one story, no community is a single story. And, you know, we're not a monolith, and that to the extent that you'll find in my short story collection, where I write it across gender, race, and generation, it's just like, you know, you like, stories can get dismissed as like, oh, we've already, you know, the immigrant tale is this, you know, but really there's like so many different ways in which people enter this country and survive, and what they face is all, you know, very different depending on geography and class and education, and you know, so much of that sort of needs to be taken into account when telling any single person's story. And so that's something that's, you know, I think been an influence in my journalism and in my fiction. But in terms of how my journalism, I think journalism has, in terms of helping me with my fiction, you know, given me the discipline of writing, or attempting to write on a regular basis, if not a daily basis, being open to collaborating with editors. And also, I think just that sense that the first draft is not the last draft. That, like, when you're a beat reporter, you cover a story over a number of weeks or months or years. And in that same way, the first thing you write out might well be terrible. Like and there are times when I'm revising and I'll be typing in block letters, like over a section, like, what was I thinking? But, you go back at it. And I think, I think also it's sort of taught me to be, mindful about deadlines and meeting them. And I think for me, the best hours of my writing are in the morning, but also sort of in the late afternoon, sort of that muscle memory of childcare ending, or, the deadline that you have to file your story. So that, I can write well against the clock, or at least write a draft well against the clock. And it was about, and in terms of fiction, I think it's helped my journalism in that I'm more likely now to think about characters and a narrative movement of a piece, and where a piece may end so that it resonates with the beginning. And I think, if I look at what I wrote in college, my earliest journalism stories resembled like courtroom stenography. It was like a series of quotes with transitions in between. And that's not storytelling. And now I'm much more likely to approach what I do with a storytelling eye. And since about 2016, I've been a weekly columnist at the San Francisco Chronicle, which is also, which has been a lifelong dream, hometown paper. And in it, I'll write about social justice issues, write about, off the news, but often bring in a family angle. I am the mother of twin boys. They're 8 years old. And so it's a lens in which to understand, like, how do you discuss racism? How do you have them become activists? Or like, how, all these things that I'm thinking about as a parent, has resonated with readers. And it's funny. A reader wrote me, he's like, I'm not a woman. I don't live with my mom. I'm not Chinese, but for some reason I enjoy what you write about. So, I mean, it is that thought that, like, writing can be a way in which it can spark empathy, and hopefully that empathy can in the future lead to action. So, but I don't know if that answered your question, but
it did.
Yeah.
Yeah, it did. And I love hearing about, just again, your whole journey as a writer, because most writers, if not all writers, have a day job. And it's easy to think, well, if I'm doing this day job, I certainly can't be a writer. But, I'm hearing from your journalism experience how it helped you grow as a writer and how it improves your writing. I mean, just all the experience you had as a journalist, you're able to bring more diverse stories into your fiction. And, like you were saying, not every immigrant story is the same. And if you had not had that experience prior, it might have affected your fiction differently. So I think that's really important to remember as a writer, and as a reader, just being open to every experience and every book that you have. And I also, it made me think about, when you opened up and you talked about how publishing this book again the second time, how all those individual stories still resonated together. And it made me think about how that commonality in your literature just mirrors the commonality in community, that there's diversity, but yet there's this common thread throughout that I think makes for really powerful stories, and just reminders of, especially in times of today, how we might feel like we're so individual and different and unique and separate, but yet if we're open to it, we'll find that commonality. And I think, sometimes that's the key, is to be open to searching for those common threads.
And to listening.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I do want to open this up to other people who would like to ask questions. One thing I'm going to do is drop in your link for your website in the chat box, so people can take a look at your work and where they can purchase the book. I don't know if anyone has a question they'd like to ask, whether it's about the stories that you've read or the writing journey, anything like that, you can certainly drop that into the chat box or raise your hand. And I see that Sarah has her hand up, so you can unmute yourself, Sarah, and go ahead and ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for reading your work. It's really beautiful, and I can see how people are really drawn into each of your stories. And I'm really curious as to, I mean, obviously you've worked on so many different writing projects, long and short and fiction and nonfiction. How do you move from project to project? And do you ever get to a point where you decide to just drop something because it doesn't feel right or it's not working?
Great question. And thank you for being here today. I think for me, well, I think for me, like sometimes I'll think let me, how do I phrase this? Okay. So my hours of power, I think I mentioned, are like in the morning. So if possible, if I'm not trying to manage some other family or work task, I'll try to spend those hours when I'm at my best on the things where I really need to immerse myself. So right now I'm in the middle of revising my next book. And so like everything, and given the pandemic and how hard it is to have any real sustained thinking time, I have to try to be disciplined to like spend that time on my novel, because that is what I want most right now, to be able to finish. At the same time, right at the beginning of the pandemic, sometimes you're just called, you just feel that call to write something. And I very quickly, within a matter of hours, wrote up an essay about a sourdough starter, but just sort of like talking about how it made me feel connected to history, to this Chinese immigrant I know who was sort of like a cook on this famed trip that helped lead to the creation of the national parks, and how he'd use sourdough and all this stuff. And so I wrote it quickly and I pitched it, and it ended up on CNN. So that was really exciting. And so sometimes you just need to be, sometimes you're going to be, even though you've got like sort of the larger thing that you're working on, you end up, I don't want to say you end up cheating on your project, but you have to go where the inspiration is drawing you at that moment, because writing is hard enough. And if I feel a very strong pull towards something, I will go towards it. That said, once this revision is in with my editor, I am excited. I have a list of essays that I want to get to, and I have a couple short stories that I'm trying to finish up. So I think in terms of switching back and forth, it's the way I manage it is sort of like there will always be periods when you need to step away from your work, whether it's a column, whether it's a short story, whether it's a novel. And perhaps there's some relationship to like the longer the work, the longer you might want to step away from it to be able to return to it with new eyes. But it's when you are stepping away, you can still sort of keep up, your projects by working on something else. But I will say this, I think this morning, the pools around here in the Bay Area, like there's this patchwork of whether they're open or not open. And this morning, the one of the local pools just reopened. So I got signed up, got myself there. I feel like a new person. And before COVID times, I used to swim every day, have been doing walks instead. But I think stepping away from the computer is also just as important for my creative process. And that it's your body in motion is when you can sort of, the things that you've been like thinking so hard at, whether you're, at your computer or whether you, do your drafts by hand, like it's being away from the writing that sometimes is so important for nurturing your creativity and kind of getting you to that next step. For example, when I was swimming, I realized there was something that I wanted. There's been something I've been sort of like mulling over, but it was only when I was sort of like swimming that I was able to realize like, I'm going to try going at it this way. So, but yeah, great question.
Yeah, I love all that you say there. Gosh, I like that phrase, the hours of power. That's really a good
Yeah.
phrase to consider when you're thinking, when is my best time to write? And I like what you say too about stepping away from your work and how important that is and however you tackle that. And Sarah, did you have anything else that you wanted to add or to ask before we move on?
Yeah, how important has it been for you to have or be part of a community of writers? Like, how do they help you in your work?
Oh, very important and great question. And I actually almost always like bring up this importance of community. And to have like sort of like different circles of community as well. Although in the Bay Area, sometimes it feels like it overlaps in many different ways. But just for example, I belong to the Writers Grotto in San Francisco, which was founded like 26 or 27 years ago. I haven't been in lately because of the COVID. But you know, when I first moved back in 2013, I remember going to lunch, and it wasn't just, you know, on one hand, I'd hear about where people were pitching their magazine stories and thought, maybe I'll try that too, you know, or, you know, it kind of, on one hand, inspired me to try for things I wouldn't have known to try for. But on the other hand, I remember being at lunch and a woman who had a well-respected memoir just sort of, I don't want to say casually, but maybe it was matter-of-factly said like, oh yeah, I wrote this mystery. I was hoping it'd be a commercial success. It didn't sell. And I had come to the table actually feeling a lot of shame because I mentioned back in 2009, when my novel first went around, it didn't sell. And I just remember thinking like, I'm not a real author. I can't call myself an author until I publish something. I just, you know, I feel like a failure. But just being able to hear within a community that there are ups and downs in a writer's life, that, you know, when there's success, we will celebrate together. And when there's hard times, we will commiserate. That has been everything. And, you know, at the Grotto, we roll deep in a sense, like if there's readings, we all show up in mass, we promote each other on social media. But I mean, I found writing communities in other ways as well. Voices of Our Nation for writers of color. And I had a writing group that stemmed out of that. The Community of Writers, the Napa Valley workshops. I almost always have left a workshop with a reader or two. And I mean, I'm in 2 writing groups now, and they often, you know, and it's like one writing group I've been in has been together since 2001, and we all live in, you know, different places now. We used to meet in person, but now, like, you know, everyone has kids and or just other responsibilities, and so I don't know, like different writing groups can provide different feedback, or they're just different people. So, you know, community is very important. But actually, I know of a writing group where they don't ever exchange work, but it's almost like a support group in a sense. Just to be, you know, just taking their temperature with each other and checking in regularly with each other has been really important for them. So, and I think people ask, you know, oh, like, how can I, or like, especially they might feel like shy, or how do I get to know people? And I think more often than not, people will be excited if you reach out to them, if you suggest forming a group. Or another thing I've suggested to people is to volunteer. Here in the Bay Area, volunteering for Lit Quick or the Bay Area Book Festival, often the other volunteers are writers as well, or reading for a literary magazine or for a publisher. These are all ways, sometimes you can feel more comfortable like being a part of something if you're doing something, if that makes sense. And then the friendships stem from that. And so even though the act of, you know, writing itself, finishing your book is going to be completely solitary, the ways in which you can find community are really important. So, but great question.
Yep, I totally agree. Those are great suggestions too. Thank you, Sarah, for your questions. I know Daniela had a question, so you can go ahead if you like.
Yeah. Hi, Vanessa. Thank you so much for being here. And I've been such a big fan. I feel like you write beautiful and vivid stories of like lived experiences that are really hard to come by. And I feel like you write with such like compelling authenticity that I really enjoy.
Thank you.
The questions that I have are essentially, how do you, like with COVID and everything that's happening, this administration, and every day there seems to be news, and you sort of mentioned this with sourdough, but in terms of like what stories are surfacing for you this time that you are kind of eager to sort of tackle, and also how do you decide between what feels urgent and relevant but is like relevant to you? So how do you align like your voice with whatever is happening in the world? And I guess both as a journalist, but also an essayist and novelist.
Yeah. Thank you for coming today and for a great question. I think it's something that a lot of creative writers have been grappling with. And I remember in the early days of Shelter in Place, when I was doing these online events, it was, poets, nonfiction writers, fiction writers, across all genres, people were saying like, I'm just not writing right now. They just felt it was enough to just sort of, it was hard enough to just get through the day. But now we're in day 120, or I don't even know. And it's sort of like, okay, we kind of moved from that phase in one sense, but in terms of, there is that larger question of like, did everything before the middle of March, is it now all like historical fiction, or does it all feel sort of like coated in this layer of dust and what's relevant? And I remember in 2016, I was on book tour, and the day before the election, I was in DC, and the reading was joyous and there was so much hope. Then election day, and then, there was a big question with the organizers, should our events get canceled? Like sirens were going off all over the city in New York. I then moved to New York to do my next two events. And we decided, I was reading with other people on both events, and we decided to make this space. And so we read from our work, but we also sort of like opened up the discussion to like, what was the purpose of art, or what was the purpose of immigrant stories in terms of like opening conversations, or making that, holding that space for other people, or making a space for people to, I don't want to say escape, but just somewhere else to be other than in sort of like the spiraling worry of their thoughts. So I think for me, in terms of what's happening now, both with Black Lives Matter and with the pandemic, I think things that are more like, I did a whole sort of like civil rights package, that included everything from like efforts by Asian Americans to confront racism in their own communities, to, putting out a call for protest poetry, and from readers, and kind of seeing how they were making sense of the moment or not making sense of it, to sort of like, how do you teach racism to the next generation? And so it felt like I needed like to not write about that in my column, almost felt like I was writing myself into irrelevancy, right? Because like, this is what's on my mind. This is what feels like, and to the extent that my column offers a platform, I want to be able to sort of do what I can on that level. And that was why I think I was motivated to write about those issues, in the last few weeks. But in terms of like, well, how do I then, for future work, like how would I incorporate the pandemic? I don't know if I'll ever write of it. I think it's a big question. Like, I don't know, we will be shaped by these times. But just even in terms of the novel I'm working on now, which is set during the Cultural Revolution, there's a lot about isolation and touch and like things that, even though it's set, more than 50 years ago, it's a reflection of who I was at the time writing it. And that's going to make its way into the narrative, even if it's not about a pandemic. But in terms of, police brutality and Black Lives Matters, it's that sense of like, there's climate fiction, where they say like, but the question is like, if you don't reference climate change, or if you don't reference systemic racism, or even if it's like not the main thrust of your book, like if it's somehow not referenced or part of your ecosystem, then in some sense you're, not accurately reflecting the world we live in. So like, I think I've become much more conscious about systems of power. And that's something, again, I don't know if it wouldn't appear like as didactically in the work, but it would be part of, understanding when I'm doing that deep work of understanding about like a character situation or what they're up against. Like, I think that would be part of it, no matter what it is that I'm working on in the future. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, that was. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Daniela, for asking that question, and Vanessa for your answers. You touched on the same things that I was trying to mention before, but you added to it that keeping an open mind and listening and providing that space of, letting the literature become this talking point as a bridge from stories on the page to stories in the present and in real life. And I love that. I think, what makes a great story is one that resonates along this continuum of time. So like you say, you're writing about something in the past, but looking at it through this filter of today. And really, I forgot who said it, but there was a quote about historical fiction that it's not really historical fiction. It's just acknowledging that our past is our present and our future. If we, if you really take a look at it, and what are we going to learn from that, and how are we going to relate that to what's happening with today? So like you said, you can't help but have those things bleed into the work that you do. And I think, again, that's what makes a great story. It is 2:00, so if there's anyone else who has a question, please don't hesitate to raise your hand. I want to give you another opportunity to do that, and flip through the chat box so that you can catch those links to Vanessa's website, as well as a link to get a signed copy if you would like to. And you can do that by going to Orenda Books and just leaving a note as you process your order that you'd like to get a signed copy, and Vanessa said she is able to do that for you. And I want to say thank you again to Vanessa. First of all, thank you to Counterpoint Press for bringing your book back to us again, and to Vanessa for sharing your stories here, and to the participants who are here. It's been a wonderful discussion, and I love hearing all that you said, and I love the opportunity to hear your reading. If you want to stop back for other author readings coming up, there's another one coming up on the weekend. So just drop by hiddentimberbooks.com and you can check that out, and you can register for free for these events. This is recorded, so you can also take an opportunity to rewatch it if you want to catch some of the great suggestions and advice that Vanessa brought to us today, or to share it with others. And is there anything else you'd like to add, Vanessa, before we close?
Thank you all for taking part of your day to spend with me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you again for hosting us all.
Yeah, thank you. And I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of the day and rest of the week. And we will hopefully see you on a line again soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And Vanessa, if you want to hang on for just a second.